Thank you, and you're listening to another episode of DJ Dell's Dynamic Music Podcast. I'm your host, DJ Dell 523. It's been a little while, a couple of days, if you will, since I put out the last podcast, and I thought I would put out something a little different today. Normally I talk strictly about music, and that's obviously a good thing, and that's something that I enjoy talking about, but I also like talking about issues sometimes too, and I figured that today's topic, which I'm not going to spend a lot of time on, but I'm going to give my basic thoughts on how I feel about it, is something that has actually affected music and popular culture today, and that would be cancel culture. That being said, what does cancel culture mean? Well, the common definition for what it means refers to a popular practice of withdrawing support for canceling public figures and companies after they have done something or said something considered objectionable or offensive. Cancel culture is generally discussed as being performed on social media in the form of group shaming. Now, my thoughts on cancel culture. Now, I kind of have mixed feelings on it, really, because in one sense, I do think that it's really great that certain bad behavior is actually being put to the forefront now, because I believe whether it be dealing with, say, sexual harassment or other things of that nature, in the past, the reason why people were able to get away with these things is simply because no one spoke out, either because they felt afraid to, or they were somehow either coerced or maybe even bribed not to. So basically, they were able to work in the shadows, and that's the way that they were able to get away with doing certain things for such a long time. So the fact that we have things like Me Too and that out there that do expose people, that in and of itself I do think is a good thing. However, I do have certain issues with it. First of all, part of my issue is that we have gone from being a case where people who were doing bad things and were caught doing those bad things were appropriately punished to now being the judge, jury, and executioner of these people. And not only that, but in a lot of cases, before anything can either be proven or disproven, as soon as someone comes out with an allegation or whatever, or something surfaces from many years ago, the first thing that they want to do is just cancel these people out. And I have to say that I do have a problem with that, because at the end of the day, what do you learn from that? Because if you just simply wash away a problem, then you're not really learning anything from it. Plus, you want to get to the root of the problem. The other thing that I find with that as well is that if we're just canceling people out and we're just dooming their careers or whatever, not over something that they've been found guilty of, but merely on the idea that you heard something. The problem that I see with that is we're not really teaching the art of redemption. Like, we're saying, okay, you know what? We're going to punish this person for doing a certain thing, which is understandable, but then we're not showing the other side of it. So if somebody said something stupid when they were a teenager, say 15, 16 years old, the person's now 40, and now something surfaces from when this person was 15 or 16 years old, and we're saying we want to get rid of that person because they said something stupid as a teenager. I think as much as I understand the point that we need to be able to acknowledge that we did something wrong, I also think that there is something called redemption. I do think that there is something out there where people may be immature in their youth, or maybe even hateful, but throughout the years, they've mellowed out, they've seen the error in their ways, and they've changed. And the problem that I see with a lot of this is we're not giving the person the opportunity to do that. And when I say this, I'm not referring to someone who got caught red-handed now doing something bad. And I'm not even talking about someone who's necessarily doing something criminal. I'm talking about even as far as somebody saying something stupid, or even having a viewpoint that as quickly as we want to cancel them. The reality is we have to look at it in terms of what they're doing right now. And if the way that they're conducting themselves now would indicate that they're not the same way as they were, say, back in 1975, then I think that we should be able to acknowledge the fact that the person changed. Now, if confronted with, say, the sexist comment that was made in 1975, I think it's fair for the person to be able to acknowledge that, hey, I said it, but I also think that it's fair that the person should be able to say, hey, I said it, and you know what? That was 45 years ago, and times were different then. And yes, I will admit my viewpoints back in 1975 were wrong. And I've realized long ago that my viewpoints were wrong, and I've gone about changing my way of thinking, changing my way of behaving to illustrate the fact that I am no longer the person that I was 45 years ago. Yet with cancel culture, what they want to do is they will take that incident of somebody saying something back in 1975 is now 2020. They will turn around and say, well, because this person said something then, that this person needs to be canceled. We got to stop watching his movies. We got to stop buying his music or her music because they said something that was controversial then, back in 1975. But I think you got to ask yourself two questions. First of all, if we're dealing with that time period, you have to ask yourself the question, yes, it's controversial now because obviously mindsets have changed. Society has changed. Things that were deemed acceptable back in 1975 aren't necessarily acceptable now. However, you have to ask yourself the question, at that time, was it deemed acceptable? Now, we're not saying that it's right and we should consider it right, but the thing is, if it was a social norm back then maybe the person may not be evil. Maybe the person is just doing what was done during that time period. Now, if they're still doing it now, that we've been educated on the subject and know that, calling people certain names or using certain terms to describe certain people, you just don't do that anymore. If they're still using that terminology or acting in that way, then okay, all bets are off. But if they're showing no signs of acting that way and they've changed with the time, I think it's unfair to have them just completely ruined because of something that they said back when it was socially acceptable to say it, but now since society's changed, they themselves have also changed. And this is the problem that I see, and it affects the music industry as well as it affects entertainment, and that because you have these people who just want to get rid of everyone. And I think the problem with that is, although they may mean well, the problem that I see with this is, where is it going to end? Because at some point, one of these people who's virtue signaling, saying that somebody should be canceled because of something they said 30 years ago, I think you should really watch yourself when trying to do that, because there's certain things that we're saying right now that we deem absolutely okay. But chances are, if we were able to go in a time machine, if time machines existed and we were able to go in the future 30 years, I can guarantee you right now there's certain things that we say and do that are deemed acceptable now that may not be acceptable 30 years from now. And if you're a young person right now who's doing that, and just say 30 years from now, let's say you're 50 and you're established in your career, do you want to be canceled for something that you did 30 years ago that was deemed totally acceptable at the time, but because sensibilities have changed over the preceding 30 years, that all of a sudden now, even though it was acceptable then, and yes, you've changed with the times yourself, so you no longer use that terminology or act that way now 30 years in the future, but because someone found a YouTube video of you saying something that wasn't deemed controversial then, but we see it controversial now 30 years later, that you should be canceled, I just don't think that's right. I just don't think that that's right at all. I think what we need to do is we need to look at things at a case-by-case basis, and I also think that what we need to do is we need to not only do we need to correct bad behavior, but we also have to show compassion, and we also have to show the ability to let people be able to redeem themselves. Because you know what? We can cancel everybody out, and I know some people would argue that this would teach children that if you do something wrong, that you pay for it. And I absolutely believe that there should be consequences for bad behavior. However, it should also be shown that if you make one mistake, that should not just be the end of everything. Because some people who venture into a life of bad things, the reason why they do it is because they feel, in some cases, that there's no way of redeeming themselves. So they're like, you know what, forget it, I'm just going to keep going this path because there's nothing I can do to redeem myself. Whereas if we show that they can redeem themselves, we show that, you know what, despite making that mistake, if you show that you truly are remorseful for what you did, and you show that you've learned from your mistake, and moving forward, you're doing things not to repeat that, I think that you are entitled for that redemption. And this is the problem that I see with cancel culture right now, is that we're going down a path where we want to get rid of everybody, and we don't give a person a chance to be able to explain themselves and or even just apologize. And let's be real. If you come at someone in an aggressive fashion right off the bat, that person's going to be defensive. And if we turn around and say, well, that's proof positive that that person was wrong because they're getting defensive. No, it's not because you mentioned it that they're being defensive. They're being defensive because the way that you approach them with the issue. Had you just come up to them and said, hey, you know what? We found an article here from Vanity Fair from 1975, and it said that you felt this way back then. Can you say that this is real? Confirm or deny? And then if you say, okay, you know what? You're right. I did that back in 1975, Vanity Fair. I had an interview and this is what I said. However, my views are different now from what they were then. To be honest with you, it was a sign of the time. I didn't think that anything was wrong with it, but over time I realized that, you know what? Some of that way of thinking was probably offensive, and I've changed my ways since then, and I haven't thought that way in decades. To me, somebody says that, and if they say, you know what, if I offended somebody back in the day, I apologize. If you say that, to me, that's case closed, as far as I'm concerned, and there should be nothing more to it. But yet you're seeing these cases right now where this is happening and people are calling for their heads. And I just say, and I can't stress this enough, people really need to be cautious of this, because what's going to happen is right now it may seem good because you're on your soapbox and there's a group of you doing this and you feel that you have power because people that normally you couldn't have an effect on them one way or another, all of a sudden you feel powerful because you have an effect on these people because you can ruin their career. The problem is, one day you may never know. You may have a situation where maybe you're going to decide to go into public office or something like that, and maybe you said something silly when you were in grade 8. Somebody remembered that, and just remember, in these days and time, kids have access to cell phones and they have all kinds of things where they can record stuff in that, and you move 30 years into the future, all of a sudden somebody pulls up, some audio of you saying something a little silly when you were 12, 13 years old, and going by this, it can ruin you. Even though it may not have even been controversial at the time, but now, moving into the future, it is controversial, and we've stepped away from that. You said it back in a time when it was deemed acceptable, but due to cancel culture, we think that no matter what, if we say it's bad now, even if it wasn't bad then, we're going to retroactively say it was always bad according to people, and we're going to punish you as such. You're wading into dangerous water there, because now all of a sudden, anybody can be canceled. And are we really learning anything from that? I don't think we are. I think what we need to do is we need to make these situations teachable moments where, yes, you can acknowledge that something was wrong that was said, but also explain why it's wrong and how you can do things to change it. And I think that that's the most important thing. Anyway, that's my talk on cancel culture today. That's my thoughts. I went a little longer than I normally do for my shows, but I'm very passionate about this because although I understand why they're doing it, and like I said at the very beginning of the show, I think that people who are out there who are predators and otherwise that need to be stopped definitely need to be stopped. But what I think that we need to caution ourselves with is when it comes down to opinions or even behavior or something being said that was said decades ago, but now we want to punish somebody retroactively rather than just giving them an opportunity to explain themselves and even show through their present day actions that they're no longer that person. I think we need to be able to teach forgiveness when it's not crimes that are being committed. Somebody like a Harvey Weinstein who committed a crime, that's a different story. But if it's just somebody saying something silly on the schoolyard, which everybody was saying at the time then, but now we see it as being wrong, to punish somebody for saying something that wasn't deemed wrong at that time because it's wrong now, I just don't think that's fair, and it's not teaching anybody. Anyway, I digress. I'm done for today. I hope you enjoyed the show. I hope I didn't offend anyone, but you know what? The thing is, I'm not trying to offend anyone. I'm just speaking the truth, the way I see it. I hope that you enjoyed listening, and I will be back another time for another episode. We're going to deal with music. Sometimes we're going to talk about everyday things. We're going to mix it up and have a good time. Anyway, I am DJ Dell 523. This is my dynamic music podcast. I thank you for listening, and good night. Thank you for listening to DJ Dell 523's Dynamic Music Podcast. And remember, if you want to check out my radio show, The Urban Flow, you can check me out on Mixcloud at mixcloud.com/DJ DELL523.